writer or thinker's influence lies in what he or she does, as well as what he or she makes possible for others to try and do that was not hitherto possible, or at any rate not hitherto easy to do. Edward Said's most celebrated work is known for its exposure of the distortions in the West's, now usually called the North's, understanding of distant lands that were once called the Orient, now more often called the South, a distortion that comes from refusing to acknowledge the privilege of the metropolitan location from which that understanding is articulated, a privilege bestowed not by intrinsic qualitative sources, but rather by the brute as well as the commercial force of imperial conquest and its accompanying posture of cultural superiority. This broad exposure was extended by him and others to the distortions of the self-understanding in those distant lands induced by the cognitive enslavement of the colonized mind and its acquired mimicry of its masters. This remarkable and by now utterly familiar critique of what the cultures and ideas of the South looked like from the perspective of its metropolitan masters made it possible for others to ask a question that even the long histories of resistance that led to decolonization were not just by themselves able to give one the confidence to ask. The question, what do the ideas of the metropole look like from the perspective of the South? Not the metropole's ideas of the Orient or the South, but just simply the ideas of the metropole in its own evolving self-understanding. How do these appear from the perspective of the South? And not how do these appear from the perspective of the South that has been cognitively shaped by the metropole, but rather from the point of view of the traditions of thought and culture in the South that remain relatively uncontaminated by that shaping. As I said, the prodigious mobilizations that led to decolonization were not by themselves sufficient in preparing the ground to ask this question until they were supplemented much later by Said's wholesale stock-taking of the cultural surround of empire. So it is his work, really, that makes possible this question, and I want to now briefly pursue this question, at least to the extent that it's possible, in terms that are entirely earnest and without irony, resisting the pressures to think at the outset that there can be no perspective of the South on metropolitan ideas any longer that is not itself shaped by the metropole. If there's any such inevitable shaping, even in what I, in this exercise, am going to try and do, I want that to be presented not ex ante, before the deliverances of the exercise, but at its end, in assessing its intellectual outcomes. Those outcomes, though I'll present them initially as what it looks like from a distant perspective of once colonized lands, will turn out to have deep affinities with dissenting voices in the intellectual history of the metropole itself, voices which, however eloquent and powerful they once were, lost out in that intellectual history. If inevitably, as I suspect, this effort will seem naive to those who are perpetually and alertly poised to find in every intellectual exercise of this kind the pitfalls of nostalgia, there's nothing to do but to acknowledge that that might be so and proceed. The project that many pursue, which seeks formulations for what has come to be called alternative modernities, would be silenced if one were to be inhibited from proceeding in this way by this up-to-the-minute form of sneering about nostalgia. Of course, ignoring the sort of complacent sneering doesn't mean that in the project of seeking these alternative formulations, one ignores just how defective the traditions of the South may have been in their feudal and other aspects, any more than Said ignored that, and indeed any more than Said ignored how admirable certain dissenting voices in the West were, which he repeatedly acknowledged as his inspiration. Said is in fact exemplary in this regard, in recognizing how even within the weight and preponderance of one's critical efforts in politics and culture, just how selective one has to be, both in what one repudiates from the frameworks of the North and what one invokes from within the perspective of the South. So long as the criteria by which one is selective is not arbitrary and is theoretically and politically well motivated, there's no reason to be stopped by anxieties that these alternative formulations of modernity will seem to be out of step with what seems possible for one's time. So what follows takes his example to heart, constantly braiding what I have called the perspective of the South with the dissenting critiques in the intellectual history of the North. A good place to begin, it would seem, would be to look from the perspective of the South at the most central political ideals that define the modern period of the North, the ideals of liberty and equality. How do these seem from a conceptual distance, a distance at which those ideals have never really had a distinct centrality, at any rate not in these explicit terms? The first thing that would come into view, I think, is a bizarre development. Virtually as soon as these ideals were first articulated, they were elaborated in theoretical and methodological developments in such a way that they were chronically and acutely at odds with one another. Why, one should ask, if one was not oneself in the midst of that framework, does an outlook describing itself in such self-congratulatory terms as the Enlightenment declare and deeply and rightly cherish two remarkable ideals, and yet immediately come to understand them so that they are in a sort of zero-sum tension with one another, such that increasing one seems always to be accompanied by the necessity to decrease the other? A distant observer would notice this peculiar phenomenon everywhere and entrenched in the philosophical and political arguments of the politics and rhetoric of Cold War disputation just being the most recent version of it and the most crude and spectacular version of it. Why should a tradition of political thought theoretically frame its two chief ideals in such a way that they're pitted against each other? That's a question which cannot possibly get an answer that leaves out the much larger context of the sort of political economy that had developed in Europe and the effect it had on political theory in and since the Enlightenment. I can't pursue that context in a brief lecture, whose main theme lies elsewhere. I can't, in fact, do much more than mention one or two features of the political theorizing that produces this tension. Given the deep roots that these features have taken in our sensibility and practice, we have come to see it as virtually impossible to question these features without seeming to be pursuing quite unintuitive or outdated lines of thought. One feature is too well known and well mined to bear much more than the most minimal mention, and that is the linking of the notion of property to a notion of personal liberty, which its ownership bestows on one, a liberty that is carried in a right and therefore enshrined in the law of the land. How the possession of private property, when seen in these terms, undermines equality in the economic sphere, and therefore in other spheres, has been the subject of extensive commentary, and Marx was, of course, only its most famous and most powerful critic. Less explicitly theorized is another feature, which I will call the incentivization of talent. It seems to us the most natural thing in the world to think that someone's talent should be acknowledged as hers, and that it is she who should be praised and rewarded for it. We think it a failure to respect someone's individuality to fail to do so. Take any example of a poem or a scientific discovery or a fine test century. We praise individuals for such things and other such products of individual talent and expect them to be rewarded whether it's a poet or a scientist or a batsman. We don't simply praise the zeitgeist for such productions, we praise the particular individuals, and we think the rewards they get for it are deserved. Notions such as desert thus also get linked to one among other rights possessed by individuals. This goes so deep in our thinking that it's likely to be considered an hysterical egalitarian ideologue's artifice to deny it. Denying it seems to fly in the face of our intuitive understanding of what it is to be an individual, rather than just a symptom of the zeitgeist in embodied human form. It violates what we conceive to be the liberty of an individual to reap the praise and rewards of the exercise and efforts of her talents, not to mention the liberty of others to enjoy the productions of these efforts at their most excellent, because they are incentivized to be as excellent as they can be. But like the liberty attaching to the possession of property, this way of thinking of liberty as attaching to talent also promotes social and economic inequality in ways that are too obvious to spell out. This feature is less structurally central to our culture than the liberty that is tied to property, but it perhaps goes even deeper psychologically, and the dichotomy it generates with equality is therefore more subtly troubling and seems just as impossible to overcome. I mention these two sources of the tension between these two ideals to give a completely familiar sense of how far such thinking has gone into our sensibility, how entrenched it is in the very way we deploy these two notions or terms, and how therefore it would seem almost to change the semantics of the terms if we were to think that the tension could be removed or resolved. That is to say, if we managed per impossibile to see them as not being in tension, it would only be because, as Thomas Kuhn said, we have changed the meanings of the terms involved, liberty and equality, not because we've produced an improved theory of politics within the framework of the Enlightenment. Within that framework, things are, on this score, unimprovable. In other words, what I mean by framework here is perhaps one of the diverse things that Kuhn meant by his term paradigm, and if so, clearly we need to shift to another framework if we are ever going to remove this tension between these two notions. In such a new framework, neither liberty nor equality would mean what they mean in the framework of Enlightenment thought, no more than mass in Einstein's physics meant what it meant in Newtonian mechanics, if Kuhn is right. So, how might such a shift in frameworks be sought? To seek it directly by brutally redefining the terms or announcing a new term, Etienne's neologism, equiliberty, for instance, might come off more as a valiant act of semantic stipulation. But the worry is that it might be an act in vain. This sort of willful dictation of nomenclature seldom works, except perhaps in purely classificatory exercises which don't pretend to theory. To say from now on, I will use the word X as follows, with a view to presenting an alternative theory, is to place the cart ahead of the horse. Discourse about human concerns should be posterior to, a natural outgrowth of a prior conceptual understanding. It can't by itself declare new forms of understanding into existence. What makes language so central, and this was addressed by Etienne in the question about philology, what makes language so central to our human concerns is not that it can itself dictate how we think, but that it's the repository of how we think and how we have thought. So new frameworks for thought built on existing concepts must be constructed first, and this may then have the effect of revising the meanings of the terms by situating them in a new conceptual surround. So in keeping with this obvious suggestion, here is what I propose, still with this pretense that I'm gazing from the south. There's no improving our understanding of these notions of liberty and equality as they stand so as to resolve the tension between them. So let's, as a start, just usher them off center stage. If this is to disinherit the entire tradition of liberal thought of the Enlightenment, so be it. Once these are exeunt, we need to replace them on center stage with a third, more primitive concept, that is to say, a concept more fundamental to our social and political life than even liberty and equality. And this is to be done with the idea that liberty and equality may subsequently be reintroduced once again by the back door, as it were, but now merely as necessary conditions for the achievement of this more basic ideal that occupies the center of the stage. So reintroduced, there's reason to think that these terms may have undergone substantial revision in their meaning and thus may not any longer express concepts that are, in the way we become used to it, at odds with one another. We need then to fasten on an appropriately more fundamental concept. To be more fundamental than concepts such as liberty and equality, which have been so central to our theoretical understanding of politics, it would have to track something not necessarily older and more traditional in our understanding, so much as something that speaks more immediately to our experience and our quotidian lives. And here, if we continue to keep in mind that we are engaged in this exercise, finding a view from the South that hasn't been wholly dominated by the metropolitan frameworks, the folk and spiritual and popular traditions of the South outside the orbits of that framework, the concept and ideal that is most naturally on offer is the concept of an unalienated life. And I think that the perspective of several traditions of the South, from which it might seem as if the ideal of an unalienated life could be extracted as the most fundamental goal of politics, would find deep affinities in a long tradition of dissent in the North, dissent from its own orthodox and dominant framework, starting with early prescient radical sects of Christianity, for example, in the English Revolution, well before the Enlightenment, a whole range of subsequent scientific dissenters against the willful exploitation of science for profitable gain, through some canonical romantics mentioned earlier today by, I think, Etienne and maybe Amir, and then Ruskin, Morris, Thoreau, the so-called early Marx, that's a canard, the early Marx was the late Marx, all the way down to Heidegger and to Horkheimer and Adorno. I won't spell out the affinities between them and the Southern perspective, but instead let me just try and put a roughly analytical framework on what the sources of alienation appear to be from this perspective, with a view to approaching some broad conclusion about what the notion of an unalienated life might be seeking to address. From the popular rather than the elite and imitative traditions of the South, it would seem that something like the following very general question might be initially fruitful in expressing their puzzlement about what they see from such a distance. How and when, they might ask, did it come to pass in a whole dominant part of the globe that the world came to be seen, not merely as a place to live in, but a place to master and control? This question gives a very primitive and premonitional sense of the sources of alienation, but posed in just these terms, it is so omnibus a question that it's hard to know how to go about answering it. At this level of generality, perhaps all one can do is to see what sort of issue is being raised in raising it. thus consider a development in high philosophy, from within which the genealogical dimension of the question's point comes a little into focus. The South's more philosophical observers would notice, for instance, that in the North, philosophers have for 200 years recurringly raised in epistemology skeptical questions about our knowledge of the external world. But sometime in the 17th century, primarily in the hands of Descartes, a new conclusion was drawn. If one can doubt our knowledge of the external world, quite possibly the external world does not exist. No skeptic in the tradition ever drew this conclusion till Descartes. The ancients who formulated skeptical doctrines never concluded that the world may not exist from their assertion that there was no knowledge of it. Why not? Because they did not assume that the only way to relate to the world was via knowledge. They took it for granted that if one were to doubt the possibilities of knowledge, that would do nothing, at any rate nothing wholesale, to undermine the more ordinary relation we bear to the world of merely living in it. It was Descartes' innovation, one that expressed a transformation in his time, whose legacy is that of an increasing detachment of outlook towards the world we live in, elevating the idea of living in it itself into some highly cognitively mediated relation that underlies what the question puts forward as the thing to be analyzed, mastery and control. But much more breakdown of the question is needed if you are to go beyond the generality to some detailed analysis. Bringing in broader observational perspectives from the South than purely philosophical ones, 4 further breakdown questions might help to make more vivid the sources of alienation. They are, I'm going to just put down 4 questions. How and when did we transform the concept of nature into the concept of natural resources? How and when did we transform the concept of human beings into the concept of citizens? How and when did we transform the concept of people into the concept of populations? And how and when did we transform the concept of knowledges to live by into the concept of expertise to rule by? And the reason why each of these questions, which you will recognize as echoing at a more specific and tractable register the highly general question I first posed, all of these questions hint at an underlying source of alienation that each of them tries to genealogically uncover, an increasing detachment or disengagement in the way one approaches its chief subject, whether it's nature or humanity or knowledge. So in a brief lecture, I'm going to only speak to the first 2 of these 4 questions, before concluding with some very rudimentary remarks about what an ideal of an unalienated life that seeks to overcome these 2 sources of alienation might, in its most crude and sloganized form, it's really going to be very crude by the end, look like from this traditional perspective of the South. Within the outlooks of that traditional perspective, nature was not equated with natural resources, almost always because the tradition took nature to be sacralized, a built-in constraint against seeing it as a mere resource, even if one lived on it and by it. And this is just how much of popular Christianity conceived of nature in the early modern period in Europe. Sometimes this strand was described by intellectual historians as Neoplatonism. Thus, for instance, the radical Puritan sect, the Diggers, among others, among a whole lot of others in England, resisted the system of enclosures because it was transforming something sacred, something to live in, to make a life in and to respect, into a resource and a site for what we now call agribusiness. Not the new science itself, but the outlook that was emerging around the new science of that period, was precisely keen to undermine these sacralized conceptions so as to remove all conceptual obstacles to predatory commercial extraction from nature. And scientists of the Royal Society in England and its counterpart somewhat later here in the Netherlands and then the rest of Europe were aligning themselves with commercial interests and with high Christianity. In England, this was the Anglican Orthodoxy, which opposed the Neoplatonism of the popular Christianity of the radical sects as dangerous enthusiasm. These are the developments that, if one were to see them as alien to the perspective of the South, one would find that that perception anticipated pervasively among the dissenters of the late 17th century and early 18th century in Europe who fought against such a desacralization of nature. These dissenters appealed to Neoplatonism of the early radical sects as a form of resistance to the emerging outlook wrought by the new science that was, with alliances it had formed with commercial interests, transforming the local, egalitarian, collective agrarian life. Much of this was consolidated in systematic political thought of the North by familiar and celebrated ideas of a posited, conjectural past in which contracts, social contracts, were said to have been generators of norms and principles to live by. Thus, for instance, in one dominant familiar strand of the contractarian tradition, going from Locke to Robert Nozick, there are other strands which are not relevant for what I'm saying, this is what we are told. Suppose that we start in a state of nature. Suppose that there are as yet no policies or laws to live by, nor is there any sort of institution for property. Then suppose that some of us join and come up with an agreement with which we resolve to keep faith, an agreement about rules for the private appropriation of property out of the common. We agree that if someone comes upon a stretch of ground, fences it, and registers it with some primitive form of bureau that we also set up, then it becomes his or hers. And now this is the punchline, we then say to ourselves that this may only be done if by doing so no other is made worse off than they hitherto were. And we elaborate this crucial proviso by saying in particular that if one were to hire others at wages which enable them to live better, they would in fact be better off than they were in the state of nature. The underlying claim of these theoretical posits of a contract, in all versions of contracts, is to show one thing: how come we are, as a result of the contract, better off than we were in a state of nature. In the strand that I'm focusing on, the assessment of political principles by such a conjunction of mutual advantage in aggregative, ameliorative conditions, both for possessors of land and those who worked on it, becomes the cornerstone of an economic outlook, liberalism, even through a later period of industrialization, when industrial capital rather than land was at stake. In its historical context, what this contractarian notion consolidates and justifies is the system of enclosures, which, though it had begun fitfully a century earlier, had set in deeply and systematically, backed by the law, in society only in Locke's time. And it's what led to these predatory commercial attitudes towards nature and its bounty. The Lockean social contract, as a bit of political theory construction, both explains these developments while in a carefully constructed normative facade, it presents them as moral and political achievements. The entire doctrinal outcome of such a theorization, appealing to a conjectural past, is thus presented as having both an historical inevitability and a rational justification. An appeal, therefore, on two quite different registers, the descriptive and the normative. The historical embedding of social contract theory is more fully revealed if we take a look at some of its arguments and assumptions via criticisms implicitly found in the range of dissenters and enthusiasts that I've just mentioned. Let's return to the punchline of the familiar contract scenario. This is what I'd said in the exposition. We agree that if someone comes upon a stretch of ground, fences it, and enters it in some primitive form of bureau, we then say to ourselves, this may only be done if by doing so no other is made worse off than they hitherto were, and we elaborate this proviso by saying in particular that if one were to hire others at wages which enable them to live better, they would in fact be better off than they were in the state of nature. Now, the radical critique of this imagined scenario would respond something like this. Such a contractual outcome, as is expounded here, has what might be called, what economists would call, an opportunity cost. What's that? An avoided benefit when you make a choice is counted as an opportunity cost of you having made that choice. This idea applies straightforwardly to our case. What the radical critique says is, because the land is thus privatized, you can just hear Winstanley saying this, because the land is thus privatized, we cannot set up a system for working the land in common and as a commons. Thus, even though we agree that we are all better off than we were in the state of nature, it is still perfectly possible for us to say that we are worse off than we would have been had the private economy not been established. This is a simple and obvious enough counterfactual, but it has a very significant and less than obvious theoretical result. It philosophically transforms the very notion of consent to something that is not even so much as recognizable from the contractualist tradition. Consent, once this counterfactual is in place, should be viewed instead as a more complicated act than might seem in that tradition. It should be viewed as follows. Whether someone can be said to have consented is not necessarily to be viewed as this contractualist tradition proposes, but rather it may be a matter of what he or she would choose in situations that do not obtain. In which case, the entire Locke to Nozick tradition of thought may be assuming that we've implicitly rationally consented to something to which we have not in fact consented. Such a revisionary understanding of the notion of consent can be understood as offering a counterfactual maneuver in order to improve upon the normative ideal that the tradition offers, or if you find that a tendentious way of putting things, at the very least an alternative normative ideal. But really the point I'm insisting on is that this entire line of criticism, in any case, is not an idle theoretical counterfactual exercise at improving the normative ideal, because history gives considerable support to the counterfactual by recording a tremendously active and vocal dissenting tradition in the early modern period against the orthodox ideas about the economy and the polity. Some of these dissenters, the early ones, were not targeting Locke, since they in fact predated Locke. I include them even so because the counterfactual I've presented should not be thought of as an argument from anachronism. It is counter to fact, as counterfactuals are, but the point is that it's not counter to all facts. It is counter only to facts which came to be because others very much in the air did not survive for reasons that need not by any means be described as having the force of rational necessity about them. Their failure to survive, far from being determined by rational force, was a matter of the success of particular worldly alliances that I mentioned, which were formed at a particular period of time, and they managed to silence a lively and systematic resistance to them by quite different dissenting ideas, a silencing that owed nothing to rational superiority, but rather to the greater force of worldly organization of elite interests on the victorious side. The dissenters, Winstanley, Baldwin are just two names, gave serious elaboration of the ideas contained in the counterfactual I've proposed, ideas about precisely what might be possible for the economy and polity if one did work the land in common. And in fact, the diggers actually implemented it in various parts of England for a while. If I'm right, this counterfactual, with its own historical instances, detectable in the dissenting traditions of the time, shows that the normative ideal found in the very idea of a social contract are not merely consolidating the orthodox liberal doctrines that won out, but it shows also, first, that the doctrines are presented by the social contract as having a historical necessity, inevitability, which, if the dissenting critique is right, they did not possess, and second, presented via the social contract's aspiration to a normative ideal as possessing the right of rational force that they need not ever be granted as possessing. I'm keen to put on record this entire historical dissenting tradition so as to see how closely they are echoed in the struggles of the contemporary South. Consider the following report from the Kolkata Telegraph, January 7th, 2012, of what Mr. P. Chidambaram, from his perch in the Indian cabinet, has declared. I'm quoting the report. Union Home Minister Chidambaram today called for a rejection of the counter-culture against the use of natural wealth, pitching the development debate as a choice between museum thought and modern society's thought, at a time several mining and power projects are held up because of protests. Here's Chidambaram's quote, quoted in the Telegraph. I don't think we should allow the counterculture to grow, a counterculture which says that people in these areas should live as they lived 300 years ago. We are not building museums here, we are building a modern society. Chidambaram told the inaugural session of the Northeast Business Summit. The purpose is clear. These people who protest that the natural environment and the people who merely live in it was not mere resource for development, had no future in what India is to become. An entire point of view and the people who propagate it are thus made inconsequential, a people without any place in a blueprint of the future as drawn up by experts in a business summit, a people reduced to not mattering for the world, what the world had become and what India will become. This is the ultimate form of detachment in violence, to remove a people by the stroke of an ideological declaration from a position of corporate and governmental power. Sort of cognitive homicide. One might think this is just to cite a minister with a mission of development, but why attribute the outlook to a wider elite sensibility? But there's plenty of evidence of the outlook's widespread subscription. Even one of the most humane of contemporary economists, Amartya Sen, has written against those who protested the dispossession of agricultural land for corporate development projects, from those who worked on it, and said that, this is Amartya Sen's quotation from Sen, England went through its pain to create its Manchesters and Londons. India will have to do so too. This is Sen. Such a claim, which appeals to an historical analogy, is remarkable for omitting the entire historical context about which it speaks, one which reveals Sen's analogy to be grossly imperfect. Those who were dispossessed from the land and way of life by the primitive accumulation, that's Marx's term, of an earlier period in England, moved in vast numbers across the Atlantic to America. There's no place for the dispossessed of, say, rural Bengal to go, except to the already glutted cities and their slums, creating heightened forms of urban immiseration. When the mobility of labor had some sort of parity with the mobility of capital, remarks such as Sen's may have had a point. When there's complete disparity between them, with immigration laws on the one side constraining labor's mobility, and the dismantling, or really remantling, of the Bretton Woods institutions on the other, releasing capital for far greater mobility than it ever had, Sen's remark comes off as being completely of a piece with Chidambaram's, showing just how widespread the view is. This is the most humane of contemporary economists. So far in charting early sources of alienation, I've stressed the transformation of the concept of nature and its effects on generating a wholesale extractive form of political economy. But as I said earlier, in posing those four questions from the Southern perspective, as well as from the dissenting point of view of the North, these issues of nature and political economy are inseparable from questions of political governance. On the question of the transformation of human beings into citizens, the issues are ripe for misunderstanding, given what seem to be honorable commitments to many Enlightenment ideals. But let me present some aspects of these commitments as they appear from the perspective of the South, though I think Laila did a very good job of doing exactly this. I'm going to come up to a slightly different perspective. From this distance, it would seem that Europe in the late 17th century, as a result of some of the changes already mentioned earlier, had come to find outdated its early forms of legitimation of the state, which had appealed to the divine rights of the monarch who occupied it. It therefore had to seek new forms of justification for the state and the power it exercises. And it sought this justification by a quite different strategy, by looking to modern social psychology rather than a God-given right. The strategy was complex. The state was now to be seen as one half of an undecouplable conjunction with a new form of entity. This entity, which came to be called the nation, could not sufficiently be defined in purely territorial terms and borders. If it was conceived merely territorially, it could only justify the state in terms of the power it needs to protect it from other such entities. But that wouldn't justify the state's power or authority of its own populations. A further element was needed then, a commitment drawn from the populace. Contractualist accounts were presumably relevant too, but they came from high philosophy. A justification was needed from the populace. So a crucial element would have to be less fictional than a contract and less hypothetical, more grounded in actual psychology of the citizenry. The populace had to be made to develop a feeling for this new kind of entity, the nation, and because the latter was understood as being inseparable from the state, hyphenated conjunction, the feeling for the first half of this hyphenated conjunction would confer a justification upon the second half. In due course, the feeling would come to be called nationalism, understood in terms that are at odds with the traditional perspective of the South that I'm stressing, which, as I think Judith was discussing, sought to define nationalism as wholly synonymous with anti-imperialism, emptied of its European connotations. These points are so familiar that they might seem innocuous when viewed from the South until something equally familiar comes into view, and one asks, how did post-Westphalian Europe go about generating this legitimating political psychology, this feeling to be instilled? From the perspective of the South, it seems all over that continent up there, it was done by a method whose notoriety only came to be fully understood by Europeans in the middle of the last century as a result of developments in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, but which viewed from a sufficient distance as the South offers, will be seen to have much deeper historical roots. This was the method, creating this feeling, was done by a method of finding an external enemy within the territory and the population and despising it as the other and subjugating it as them, the Jews, the Irish, just to name just two, and thereby instigating a feeling among the rest of the population of a sense of privileged possession of this new entity, the nation, as ours. Later, when numerical forms of discourse emerged and statistical methods in the social sciences were applied, categories such as majority and minority would be deployed, and the strategy came to be called majoritarianism. And the ideals of the West, of secularism, so on and so forth, were introduced to repair this sort of damage when it came from religious majoritarianism and minoritarianism. So, from the perspective of the South, the question to keep constantly in mind is, well, unless these conditions are actually perfectly duplicated in the South, there's no reason to pursue that particular ideal of citizenship. Citizenships and the notions of rights and constitutional codes, rightly celebrated, etc., go back to notions of civility. I'm going to take just 5 more minutes. Goes back to notions of civility that emerged in the same period and the same set of ideas and outlooks of the 17th century, where one can locate the fault line. There's been fine work on civility by a whole range of intellectual historians, from Norbert Elias to Keith Thomas. In some of their descriptions, one can gather a certain semantics that was essential to how the notion was characterized. Civility, which consisted in a range of things from comportment to dress and speech, was said to be a property of the lifestyles of the monarchs and his or her courts, and cruelty was defined semantically. This has nothing to do with the facts, just part of definition, was defined as what was possessed by, in the behaviors and lifestyles, what was found in the behaviors and lifestyles of the brute populace. These were stipulations of how the words were to be used and internalized, and the effect this usage had was remarkable, one of a deeply imbibed self-deception, a fact that intellectual historians I mentioned don't mention at all, which was, the self-defective effect was that it created a screen that hid from the European monarchs and elites and courts the cruelty of their own perpetration on the brute populace, because by semantics, cruelty happened only in what they did. And from the Southern view, in the modern West or North, this screen of self-deception morphed over. This really fortifies some of the things that are implicit in what Lila was saying. And from the Southern view, in the modern West or North, this screen of self-deception morphed over from the notion of civility into the more abstract domain of rights and constitutions and codes, whereby cruelty came to be understood by nations who possessed such rights and constitutions as only occurring in nations that do not possess them. Thus, the cruelty perpetrated by the former on the distant lands of the latter were hid from the perpetrators, because cruelty can only happen in lands without rights and constitutions, an attitude completely, widely prevalent today, when it's still pervasively assumed that it can really openly happen in Mugabe's Zimbabwe or Saddam's Iraq, but not in the metropole. There's, I believe, no understanding the phenomenon of Guantanamo unless one understands how the notion of rights really morphed from the notion of civility into this form of self-deception. We don't do torture. It can't be done on our soil. It must be done somewhere else. All right, I'm just... I'll wrap up. There's lots more to say, but I'll wrap up now. If in the Southern genealogy of the North, desacralization of our conception of nature was the fault line, and even if we cannot in the historical present of the North easily conceive of a return to sacralized nature to overcome this source of alienation, we nevertheless have a more secular conceptual repertoire by which to think of what it might be to re-enchant the world. Now it's just slogans. It's arguable, I think, that the more general and underlying fault line is not desacralization, but the evacuation of value properties from the world in a fit of what I was calling the outlook of detachment, which concluded some centuries ago that nature must be characterized exhaustively as what the natural sciences study. That is nothing less than a superstition of modernity. By superstition, I mean a belief so accepted in the wider belief community that we take it on trust and forget when or how it was proved and why and in what ways it helps us to live. Among the dominant intellectual classes, it's a superstition that has been maintained by sheer intellectual browbeating, calling anybody who doesn't believe it unscientific. But there's nothing unscientific whatever about denying it. One can only be unscientific if one denies or contradicts some proposition in some science. But no science says that science has full coverage of nature. To declare this to be a superstition is not to express any phobia against science itself, but rather to the detachment that my 4 questions tried to convey. So the most general and underlying source of the unalienated life, just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg, there's much more to say, but I can't recover all the things I have to say to get back to my opening remarks. The most general and underlying source of the unalienated life lies in the idea that nature contains the sorts of things, value properties, that make normative demands on us, and when we exercise our subjectivity, to be in tune with those demands, we are in an unalienated relation with nature. And if you bring in the sorts of things that Judith was probing very deeply this morning about how the world and I and thou have to be triangulated, you'll get some idea of what further things have to go into an unalienated life. So there's much more to say, but I'll stop here. Thanks very much.
At one point you said those notions of northern citizenship should not necessarily be applied in the same way in the South. Is that something that you would actually prescribe generally?
Good. Okay. Great. Yep. Wonderful question. Listen, Peter. My thoughts. No. My thoughts desert me if there's more than one question. So let me just do it one. I think to name these traditions of the South, I think we simply have to look at folk and religious and just generally spiritual traditions, which haven't had a sort of metropolitan, well, contamination is a tendentious word, but not been shaped by what various forms of urban elites have made of them. And that's entirely caught up with issues of political economy, because forms of migration occur as a result of dispossession, most acutely occurring under neoliberal policies imposed in the South, but occurring for a while before that. And so there's movement into the cities, and so some of these traditions get lost. But so I'm trying to talk about, in India there would be bhakti ideas, and all over the South there would be Sufi ideas. Just think of the remarkable things that Morales, we don't read about it much because it isn't reported. It's not as important as China and India. But the remarkable things that Morales says to justify a whole range of, it's not as if he's just mouthing policies, implementing policies, environmental issues and so on. And these are very widely held. Morales has happened to come to power, so he's actually able to implement them, but they're all over the South. So they can be named, and they're very widespread. On the issue of citizenship, it wasn't just the broad and undefined notion of citizenship. I was talking about a very specific form of secular citizenship, right? What Amir made a distinction between secularism and the secular, which Edward was mostly concerned with. But secularism, which is a very specific political doctrine, there I was saying that, yeah, it has a certain history. You can't just bend the term to mean what you like. It has a certain history. It was brought in to repair a certain damage which came from religious wars and so on and so forth. It was necessary to deal with a deep damage which came from majoritarianism when based on religion. And all I was saying was that if those conditions don't exist in parts of the South, it would be a completely pointless mimicry of the North to adopt it. I mean, it would be much better to just try and resist those conditions that made it necessary to occur. And I think there's so much in the South still. not, alas, in my country anymore, but in many parts of the South, there are syncretic cultures. I mean, Senegal, for instance. There are all sorts of syncretic relations between ongoing religions, and the idea of secular citizenship seems like a bizarre thing to invoke. So it all depends on which conditions. And I think somebody like Said was very clear. You have to be selective in what you invoke from the South. You can't invoke everything. I mean, you know, the terrible things, the Southern society was tremendously defective. So you've got to be selective, and he himself was very shrewdly selective. I mean, in many articles, when he was criticizing Orientalism, he was also very careful to be critical of the Orient. But that's, you know, I mean, it's like getting past original sin. You just have to do what you can, and it's getting past it is a matter of bricolage. You can't define it. It's not semantics. Yeah.
Akeel, I have a couple questions about unalienated life, which turns out, I think, by the end of the paper, to be an unalienated relation to nature, or is...
Initially,
you suggest that, at least. And the first small question is whether that's a life of a person or whether it's a way of life. Do we understand that as an individual life or a way of life more broadly that comprises several possible individuals, or that is indifferent to the category of individualism? And then the second really is the return to the early Marx, i.e. the late Marx, on the notion of alienation, which, as you know, of course, has that double sense in the German. You know, one sense is externalization, the other sense really, I think, is more often than not understood as estrangement, or a stronger sense of having been dispossessed or relocated outside the self. And that's, of course, theorized in relationship to the object of labor and relations of labor more generally. And it seemed to me, though, in the examples you were giving, you talked about the evisceration of cultural traditions, which struck me as something else. And then you also seem to be talking about the exploitation of labor under the ruse of consent and contract, or through the instruments of consent and contract. And it struck me that perhaps if cultural evisceration and exploitation were two other kinds of categories separate from alienation that served your purposes perhaps better. And then my very last question is whether you mean by, when you refer to unalienated life, you're actually talking about an unmediated, an unalienated life in relation to nature, whether you're talking about an unmediated relation to nature.
Yeah, right. So, great. So my thought here, Judith, was to look at this more specific notions of alienation, these forms, say, labor's estrangement from each other, from are sophistications of something much more basic, right? That's why I said it's only initially that I think the first step in understanding the ideal of an unalienated life is to think of us as being in sync, our agency being in sync with the normative demands of properties in nature that the natural sciences doesn't study, right? Value properties. Now, I do think that if one were to develop this and fortify it with a lot more philosophy than I even put down on this paper and didn't read out, the crucial question you asked initially is, how individualistic is it? I mean, you know, how is it that one focuses just on the individual's relation to nature, but there's a whole range of other ways in which a collective can be estranged or alienated, and I really do think that it's part of the same project to find some form, and this is a phenomenological project, the idea of seeing in nature things which make normative demands on us. Right, so you see a meteorological perturbation, but at the same place you see a threat, and sciences don't study threats. Right? Now, in the same way, the collective responses to it are also, I think, it's very hard to work this out. I certainly didn't do it here, but I've tried elsewhere. It's really a matter of phenomenology too. That is, you have to see, in order to be unalienated or approximate this ideal, you have to see the demands on one as if from the point of view of all of one. I mean, I can only give analogies. I was teaching my daughter how to drive a car. So I would be driving, and I realized while I was driving, I was seeing everything from the point of view of the car, the whole car. And then, right, not my individual perspective, from the perspective of the car, and orientation was much bigger than my individual. And then I would turn to talk to her, you know, and suddenly the phenomenology was completely different. It was my individual perspective of her, not from any larger point of view. So I think we just go back and forth on this. And I think we really have to come up with a phenomenology which captures, you know, the analogy with the car and so on, that wider thing. And I don't think you can theorize alienation unless you see the need for that phenomenology. And I would, I should go back and look at the I-thou thing in Buber, the notion of address and so on and so forth. But the idea is really to find this form of triangulation, to say that there is no world unless I, as its inhabitant, and you, but I and thou is just a first step towards this more collective thing, have some of this phenomenological relationship with it, but we triangulate with it. So it can't be left out when I see the rest of it and so on. So that triangulation, I think, is just absolutely crucial. And so, well, at the very least, it's lots for you to me and talk about on this Buber thing.